All right, Molly, Cam, you ready to get started?
Yes, good morning.
Terrific. Good morning, and welcome everybody to today's episode, as it were, of the Interactive Dialogue, which is a program of Dorsey and Whitney's Food, Beverages, and Agribusiness Practice Group. For those of you who are just logged in and wondering why you can't hear anything, or if you have a colleague next to you, nudge them and make sure to remind them that they need to dial into the 800 number as well as logging in to the presentation itself. A little bit about the format of today's presentation. At Dorsey, we enjoy working with each other and like to chat, and so this program, the Interactive Dialogue, is a discussion on a topic of interest presented both for continuing education credit, but also in a format that's designed to be more of a discussion. And so that discussion includes the participants. If those of you who are listening in or on the web have any questions that you'd like to have us answer, on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat pane, and you're welcome to add any questions that you have on the topics that we're talking about today into that chat pane. If you'd like to have it be confidential, just mark something that says confidential in your question, and I'll make sure and keep it that way. Otherwise, I might mention that Chris Burkoff, for example, who I saw logged in, one of my partners, that Chris had a particular question. So with that, my name is Mike Droke. I'm a partner in the Food, Beverages, and Agribusiness Industry Group here at Dorsey & Whitney. We have about 600 lawyers in 19 practice offices around the United States and, in fact, the world, including places as far afield as Beijing and Hong Kong, London and Dallas, and Minneapolis and Seattle, where I live. So our firm has 6 industry groups, and one of those is the Food, Beverages, and Agribusiness practice, which comprises over 200 lawyers that work in a whole variety of different areas in this industry. So we're very proud to represent folks in that industry. Today's program is going to be really interesting to me personally because, as Molly and Cam know, my wife is a government affairs manager for our local public utility, so she's literally in our state capitol today. I was thinking that asking Molly, yourself, and Cam to come and give us an overview of what's happening in St. Paul is a little bit like stopping the coach in the middle of the Super Bowl and saying, hey, you're going in the locker room, how do you think the first half went? So we really appreciate you stepping out of the mix for an hour here this morning and talking to us about legislative affairs in Minneapolis. So Molly, could you start by just giving a kind of short background of what you do and what kinds of clients you work with?
Yeah, sure, Mike. Thanks, and good morning, everybody. My name is Molly Sigel. I'm the Legislative Affairs Director in the Minneapolis office at Dorsey & Whitney. I'm a non-lawyer, and I have about 20-plus years of government affairs and political experience in specifically Minnesota. If I had to classify or categorize my clients, I would say for the most part they're all business clients. Do a fair amount of work representing industry, spend a lot of time in the Environment Committee, and regulatory affairs work in general. So I've been at Dorsey. I was at Dorsey from 2000 to 2003 and happily returned again in 2016.
Fantastic. And Cam, can you describe a little bit about what you do for clients?
Sure. Well, let me echo Molly's point. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Cam Winton here. I'm an attorney and a lobbyist here at Dorsey & Whitney. And along with my colleagues, I represent for-profit companies, trade associations, units of government in seeking their goals at the Minnesota legislature, before executive branch departments, and at administrative law agencies. I'm, I think, the newest arrival to Dorsey of the bunch of us here. And immediately preceding this role here, I was at the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, where I advocated for the chamber, comprised of 2,300 companies, up at the Minnesota legislature.
Fantastic. So, first topic here is the Minnesota state government, which I understand is shifting around or shifted around in the last election. And I noticed that the final bullet point mentions it's the only divided state legislature in the entire United States. So, Molly, could you tell us, what does this mean for Minnesota?
I'm a little biased, but I think the fact that we have a divided state legislature is probably an opportunity for our business clients. I think we've already seen a dramatic change in the number and types of bills that have been introduced as we have moved from a legislature that was controlled by both Republicans in the House and Senate to a legislature that is now controlled by a one-vote majority in the Senate, and we have a DFL majority of 75 to 59 in the House. Not bringing Governor Walz into the mix, we certainly have our hands full with I'd say diverse interests on the type of bills that both the House and Senate want to put forward this year. Again, I'm optimistic that as a divided state, we can still end up with some good policy. I don't think it's going to be as extreme on either side as maybe anybody would like, and in my personal opinion, I think that might be a good thing for our clients at the Capitol.
So, Cam, Molly mentioned something called the DFL, and there are a handful of folks logging in here from other states. What exactly is the DFL?
Well, yeah, it's funny. Those of us who live and breathe Minnesota politics, it sort of becomes a normal word. But for those of us who don't do that, it's a funny one. So the Democratic Farmer Labor Party is the name of the Democratic Party of Minnesota, and it comes from the Farmer Labor Party was the powerhouse of Minnesota politics in the 30s and into the 40s. And if you wanted to get elected, odds are you were going to be in the Farmer Labor Party. They had governors, U.S. senators, House reps, and then future U.S. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was one of the leading architects of the merger of the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party with the Democratic Party. So to this day, it's the DFL.
Fascinating, and quite a long history for that party. So we have identified 8 issues to watch for this year, and we'll be addressing questions and the issues for each of them separately. But can you explain why watch these particular issues for food and agribusiness companies?
Sure. Well, for each of these 8 issues, Molly and I chose these to share with folks on the webinar this morning for 2 reasons. The first is we think it's an interesting issue in its own right that may impact the business operations of folks on the call. And the second reason is that in each case, this given issue represents a broader trend. And so for each of them, we'd like to get into the issue and then talk about the broader trend that it illustrates.
Terrific. So let's start by simply shrimp, which I couldn't imagine. I usually think of walleye, but not necessarily shrimp coming from Minnesota. So why does saltwater aquaculture something that needs regulation?
Sure. Before I turn to that really good question, let me just make sure everybody knows what we're looking at here. If you can't see it because of the color contrast, there in that gentleman's hand is a shrimp. And as we say in Minnesota, you betcha, that's a Minnesota shrimp. Pretty exciting. Grown right there in Blomkest. And those blue tanks behind them are, you guessed it, filled with shrimp. So we have a small but growing shrimp industry right here in Minnesota. And the backstory is that for decades and decades, there has been freshwater aquaculture here in Minnesota, people raising various types of fish. But more recently, people realized that instead of growing grain to turn into shrimp feed and then transporting that feed long distances to shrimp that are in more traditional shrimp going places like the Gulf of Mexico, why don't we just raise the shrimp right here? And so that's exactly what various businesses have been doing. Mike, if we turn to the next slide, we'll get a sense of some of the topics that various businesses have wanted in Minnesota law.
I'm so glad, Cam, that you asked me to turn to the next slide, because I had all kinds of puns and jokes I was going to make about this small and growing, but not shrimpy industry.
See, the jokes just write themselves. It's good stuff.
Truly. I I noticed that both a list of issues, and if you could kind of talk to that, and then also what it illustrates more broadly.
Absolutely. So I'm preaching to the choir when I say businesses are looking for regulatory certainty. Obviously, everybody in the call knows that. And right now, there's not airtight regulatory certainty in Minnesota about how various regulatory bodies are going to treat shrimp farming. Just in case anybody's unaware, you grow shrimp in saltwater. And the regulations to date have been for freshwater aquaculture. And so in the last legislative session, the 2018 legislative session, there was a bill that was included in the agriculture omnibus bill, the overall overarching everything in it, kitchen sink agriculture bill, that would have provided regulatory certainty for saltwater shrimp operations, also known as shrimp operations. And I won't get into each of the details. You can see the words there on the screen, but it would have been classified as agricultural operations. Certain permits would have been required in certain situations. There would have been certain exceptions. Unfortunately, for that goal of regulatory certainty, the shrimp bill, that as I said was part of the omnibus bill, was vetoed when the omnibus bill was vetoed by Governor Dayton. For folks who haven't tracked this closely, Governor Dayton concluded his term of service last week. Governor Walz is now the new governor. And so we are certainly hoping that in this 2019 legislative session, we will see a shrimp bill come back to the table, and I fully expect it to do so. One other point. Yeah, Mike.
Noticing that this was vetoed last year, was that vetoed specific to this component of the omnibus bill, or was it just a more general kind of sanction against the omnibus bill?
It was a general veto of the omnibus bill. A governor in Minnesota is allowed to line item out expenditures, but is not allowed to line item out policy measures. And so we will get into, later in the presentation, there's a slide about the tension between the legislature and the governor and over the powers of the administrative agencies and the executive branch agencies to make policy. And it was that tension that led Governor Dayton to veto the entire 2018 agriculture bill.
And so what is that same set of policy concerns relevant given that there's a new governor, or do you see those policy concerns shifting now with the change in the legislature?
They're still relevant, but with all respect to Governor Dayton, who, you have to, for anybody who's not sitting in Minnesota right now, there really is a culture of collegiality in Minnesota politics compared to some other states. And so I do want to note that Governor Dayton's a fine man who served the state well, but he did not come from a background in business. He did not understand the need for businesses to have regulatory certainty. It just wasn't on his radar screen. And it seems from his initial moves like Governor Walz recognizes the need for regulatory certainty and is willing to collaborate more with Minnesota's private sector businesses. Let me note one other thing on this point, and I don't want to hog too much time on shrimp, but one other broader trend that this shrimp topic illustrates is the fact that we do have examples of companies choosing not to do business in Minnesota because of that lack of regulatory certainty. So this shrimp company, Simply Shrimp, is operating, as you can see right there in that previous picture. In contrast, the True Shrimp Company said for quite a while that it was going to open in Luverne, Minnesota, but just in the past month or so has announced that no, it's not going to do that after all. It's going to open across the state line in South Dakota because of the regulatory certainty there. So here's hoping that we can improve upon some of the interactions that occurred under Governor Dayton, and it'll be a brighter day under Governor Walz.
So you mentioned both shrimp and hogging in the same sentence, which of course leads us directly to our next topic. As a West Coaster, of course, that means that I have both several vegetarians and vegans in my family. So the idea of what exactly is meat and how is it used and processed and the like is somewhat near and dear to my heart. So you've identified here various kinds of things that could be called meat, like cell-based, cultured, lab-grown. Can you describe what the differences are between those things?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a trick slide, if you will, because in fact those terms are all different terms that people have used to refer to the very same thing. And that is a cell and then an accumulation of cells that is grown in a laboratory. The initial cell is taken from a living animal, and then humans culture that cell, as I say, in a laboratory. So proponents of that product would refer to it with warm and fuzzy terms like clean meat or cultured meat. Opponents of that product would use terms like fake meat, or something that perhaps sounds a little science fiction-y and scary, like lab-grown protein. So what we're seeing is twofold. We've got, one, technological initiatives underway to bring down the cost of producing meat in a laboratory setting. And secondly, we have political initiatives underway where some opponents of this type of meat, for example, and this is all public, the Missouri Cattlemen's Association has pushed very hard against this in the state of Missouri, pushed hard to obtain laws that ban the use of the word meat when referring to this product.
You know, it's an interesting kind of observation that, first of all, we're seeing really some very significant changes to technology in how food is generated, processed, and distributed. And that as those technological changes happen, we see different ways of looking at it that can be highly politicized. So, you know, what's the difference, for example, between GMO and bioengineered, or as you say, between cell-based meat and fake meat, or whatever. So,
right.
Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned Missouri and that the Cattlemen's Association there has really taken a strong position on this for reasons I guess we would understand. Can you discuss that perspective and what it means for Minnesota in particular?
Sure. Well, the reason I mentioned the Missouri Cattlemen's Association is because it really is at the cutting edge, and Mike, you're going to note the pun there, but at the cutting edge of pushing against the use of the term meat, as I said, to refer to cells cultured in a laboratory. And at its behest, legislators did pass, and the governor signed in 2018, a law in Missouri banning the use of the term meat to refer to anything that did not come from the carcass of an animal. So here in Minnesota, initiatives against the use of the term meat are not that well organized, but different. The Minnesota Farmers Union is on record in its formal policy document as supporting this type of measure, and other Minnesota agricultural trade associations have been evaluating this topic, as folks on the call may know already. So I flagged this for folks, one, for the broad trend that you just said, Mike, that we really do see this interaction of science and policy as related to food, and two, because this is a growing area that folks who have interests will want to watch carefully.
I think it also is indicative in a way of two other points. First is the kind of focus on the naming of things. You know, what can get a name, what can get a brand, and the like, including common terms like meat, for example. And then second, state law ways of regulating that can have ripple effects across the borders. So if, for example, you have meat, you know, a product that doesn't meet the particular definition in Missouri, then it couldn't be sold there, or at least if it were, there'd be a risk of labeling lawsuits and the like. And so we see this as the technology evolves in the food business, that you know, that kind of state particular, you know, and I think you know, the most recent really major example was in Vermont, where they had a very comprehensive labeling statute that ended up ultimately becoming preempted by federal law, but you know, definitely was a bit of a tail wagging the dog, as it were.
Right.
So, in any event, so the next kind of topic has to do with the regulation of chemicals in packaging. And for anybody who's logging in from a food processor perspective, of course, any packaging regulations are super critical to how they operate. And so the list of priority chemicals, Cam, can you talk about what these are and why they're marked as priority chemicals?
Sure. In this phase of the webinar, I am very slowly going to read each of the names of these chemicals. No, I'm kidding. Folks can see them printed up there. But for anybody unaware, these chemicals are things that are sometimes found in food packaging. Other times are found in individual one of these chemicals. Not all of these chemicals is a flame retardant, but some of them could be flame retardants. Lead, obviously, found in paint, gasoline. Variety of chemicals found in various products that are sometimes found in households. The Minnesota Department of Health has noted these chemicals, and only these chemicals, as the priority chemicals. There are other lists of chemicals with other designations. And the reason we pointed them out here is that there's been an ongoing political fight over these chemicals because of the impacts that they have on reproduction, on development, on cell function.
So what does it mean to have something that's designated as a priority chemical? And let me kind of rephrase that a little bit. If I were a manufacturer and I had one of those chemicals in my packaging, or was concerned there might be, because I'm buying the packaging from some other company, what does it mean to have something that's a priority chemical?
Sure. Right now, under this particular section of Minnesota law, the Minnesota Department of Health maintains the priority list, and that's it. The political football, though, that came to the fore in 2014, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment, we think may be coming to the fore again in 2019, are requirements to either inform the Minnesota Department of Health if you have a chemical on this list in your packaging, in your product, in your flow of commerce, and or to phase out these chemicals from certain applications, such as products used by children. So to emphasize, the bill that came to the fore in 2014, called the Toxic Free Kids Act, would have required notification to the MDH, Minnesota Department of Health, and would have, in certain situations, required phase-out. That bill was amended by the time it became law, and so did not require the notification or phase-out. But Mike, if I could just continue here, the person who was the chief author of that bill in 2014 left Minnesota politics for a while, lived overseas, and now is back as the majority leader, the number 2 ranking representative in the Minnesota House of Representatives. It's Representative Ryan Winkler. He represents one of the western suburbs, a Democrat. Mm-hmm. And since he was the lead author and is now the number 2 ranking person and has demonstrated an interest in this topic, there's reason to think that this topic might be coming back to the fore. So we are watching it carefully. You'll see the picture there of Representative Winkler. No, that was a joke.
You know, the name of the proposed legislation, the Toxic Free Kids Act, is obviously pretty dramatic. And for those who are kind of logging in, just again a reminder of that list of chemicals. If I were a packing company or a value-added producer, and I wanted to find out information about what should I be asking my vendors who are sending me packaging, would that be the kind of thing that I could call you about and say, what would be the implications if this thing gets passed, so I'm prepared?
Absolutely, yeah, and that is the type of inquiry that Molly and I and our colleagues here at Dorsey receive all the time, both in the legislative affairs arena and in the regulatory arena more broadly, and then of course in the transactional due diligence work, for example, or litigation if there's a consumer complaint. Those are the types of issues we would be happy to discuss with folks in more detail.
Great. So our next kind of selected topic is pesticides, and I'm not even going to try and butcher the first word, but could one of you say it and describe what's going on here?
Well, I actually had to look that up earlier today. No, I think it's pronounced Neonicotinoid, and we're going to call it Neonic for the sake of me not butchering that word going forward. And the reason that we put this topic on today is because it's a topic that is repeatedly comes and goes from public policy in Minnesota, but certainly, as everyone that's involved in agriculture knows, it certainly does not ebb and flow from the minds of the researchers and all of those that are involved in improving the habitat for pollinators in Minnesota and across the nation. In 2016 at the Minnesota State Fair, then Governor Mark Dayton decided to issue an executive order that, among other things, created a 15-member task force to look at pollinator protection in the state of Minnesota. That, I think, got the notice of certainly industry and the agricultural community, because I think everyone knows that a lot of the attention was going to be in the pesticide component of this topic. What they did as a 2-year group, it was a group that met for 2 years, consisted of researchers, beekeepers, industry, community organizers, farmers, and the group was staffed by the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board. For the most part, I sat through probably maybe 50% of these public meetings, and my observation was that they spent a lot of time publicly talking about administration and how they were going to put this report together and get the data that they needed to provide their recommendations. So a lot of this was done in private and in some sort of subcommittee work, which was allowed under the law that oversees how these subcommittees are able to work in Minnesota. In order to make their work a little bit easier, they broke down their work in 3 key areas: habitat, pesticides, and education. And as you can probably imagine, the areas that were easier to come to some consensus was the areas of habitat and education. Issue of pesticides was obviously extremely controversial, although I think they handled it, respectfully, understanding that everyone was going to agree to disagree. I think if we might have another slide coming up about, is this?
Before we get to that, a couple of kind of questions and observations.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
First is that I always, of course, kind of think of the Minnesota State Fair as things that have been deep fried on a stick. But I've been to the Minnesota State Fair. It's an extraordinary event, and must have been quite a platform for the announcement of this as a policy initiative. And so I guess kind of my question is that now with the new governor, do you anticipate that the new governor would have a greater focus on this topic, or would it wane?
Just voicing an opinion. I would say that as the governor himself, I would say probably less of an interest in this topic and a commitment to this area, but I would say as a House of Representatives dominated by the Democrats, and some of our friends, Representative Hansen, Purcell, and Wagenius come to mind, I think it would be a big priority for them to put together a pollinator package, and those things could probably contain some very controversial things, such as banning the use of pesticides or banning the retail sale of certain fertilizers, but more likely would probably include some funding for the education and habitat improvement recommendations that were contained in the report that I'm talking about.
You'd mentioned that there were both public and non-public components of the committee work. Is that something that was kind of typical, or is that different as compared to other types of issues that started with the governor's committee?
I've followed 2 committees, one on wild rice and one on the pollinator task force, and what's interesting to me is the lack of transparency in how they come up with their recommendations. They're not required to make the documents available to the public, and for the most part, are developing their recommendations with the use of some pretty skilled moderators that the state hires on a independent contractor basis. And I think that whole process is meant to not allow people such as Cam and myself to influence the outcome of that process and truly allow those 15 committee members, which is the standard number of committee members for an executive ordered committee by the governor. So I think there's both. I think it was purposeful. I don't necessarily know that it's problematic because their recommendations are nothing more than a report that could either be implemented by the administration or put in a drawer, and both of those things have happened and will continue to happen with these types of reports. But I do think it, just from an agriculture perspective, I won't name the companies, but there were 2 specific seed companies who had representatives on this committee, as well as people that are in the business of doing landscape applications, lawn applications, and there's a lot to be concerned about if some of these recommendations catch hold and go forward. It's philosophical, and I think it kind of gets into this broader issue of, water quality and the priorities for the state of Minnesota as it relates to the future of agriculture. So I don't know that we're overly concerned today. I do expect a bill to be introduced, but I have no knowledge of how comprehensive it will be and how big of a priority it will be for the Democrats.
What are the political forces that push this as an issue? For example, to be able to have it be something that would be announced at the state fair.
Well, interesting. A couple things that were going on with the state fair as part of this executive order. A couple things went into effect automatically, and that had to do with the Minnesota, the new Capitol complex that opened in a beautiful complex that was closed for 3 years, I believe, and reopened with much fanfare and beauty. And I think others on the call could probably confirm that this isn't a unique declaration, but the governor has the ability to require what can and can't happen on that complex. And they basically said that they couldn't use certain pesticides on the Capitol complex, and that they also must only use vegetation that is considered pollinator friendly. This is something that we see coming out in ordinances in municipalities across the United States, a few in Minnesota, and I think that was all part of this big package of this executive order. So it wasn't just specific to this report, but also things that the state could do immediately to improve the habitat for pollinators in our state.
It's fascinating. I remember predicting years ago with the kind of lack of legislation coming out of Washington, D.C., that what we would see in certain areas is a trend towards hyper-localization. So that means state action or local municipality and the like. And what you're describing there is what I would call extreme hyper-localization. We're going to only buy certain products, and as a matter of policy, may not be able to set the regulatory agenda, but we can at least decide what's going on the Capitol lawn, as it were. So fascinating. Can you talk to the various recommendations that were made by the committee and how, as you mentioned, it's likely you'd see more pressure on education and habitat, but can you talk to the other issues?
Yeah, I would. I think without having the number right at my fingertips, I think there were probably close to 25 recommendations dealing specifically with pesticides. And what the group decided to do, I think what they did is they all kind of got together, the pesticide group, and came up with a fruit bowl approach of all the possible topics, and both from educational as well as a regulatory perspective. And what they did is they kind of flushed through each of those 25 topic areas. And I think everyone agreed to not judge those 25 areas, but when they got to the end of the report, what they did is they turned them into a recommendation, kind of who it affected, what it was, and whether or not it would require any long-term financing to implement that. And then they went ahead and voted. All the committee members were able to vote and rank choice voting on each one of those. And I think as the report includes all of them, but they decided to focus on the ones where there was actually the most support. And as it relates to pesticides, I think probably the most controversial recommendation was to discontinue neonic seed treatment in soybeans, and that was one that received 9 out of the total of 15 votes. If we went into if we go into the items that are contained on the slide, such as moratorium on outdoor use of neonics and the 2 mandates, those received a lot less support, and therefore were not highlighted in the executive summary of the report to the governor. So I think if I was them and I was their lobbyists, I'd tell them they should go after their low-hanging fruit this session, which would be the areas where they had the most support, and maybe leave these more controversial ones for a later time when we have, when they can support that with real policy. So if anyone has specific questions about what these are, I'm happy to answer those, but they kind of run the gamut from, letting people know that pesticides are bad to completely banning them from the use in all agriculture in Minnesota. So the full gamut of regulatory difficulty.
Well, it's definitely going to be an important topic to watch for growers, but also, of course, for value-added suppliers as well, as they determine their inputs and the like. All right, so wine and strong beer, even at 8 o'clock in the morning Pacific time. Washington's a craft brew state, and we love the idea of what I now know is called a strong beer. My wife swears by Coors Light, which I can only assume would be under 3.2%, so therefore not a strong beer, I suppose. So can you for those outside of the state of Minnesota, can you describe what the issue is here?
Sure, I can take that one on, Mike. We've been fighting for kind of who we are as a state and how we look at alcohol probably since the era of prohibition. And I would say at best we're a little schizophrenic about how we approach and regulate alcohol in Minnesota. We are a state that has, interestingly enough, we have I think between 40 and 50 municipal-owned communities that control the sale of alcohol through their municipality, and then the rest of the state operates in sort of this free market approach, which until 2 years ago excluded purchasing liquor on Sundays. But as of July 4th of 2017, we were all able to, jump from our, wherever we were Sunday morning, maybe church, maybe somewhere else, and just head right into the liquor store to pick up our beer for the football game. So I think that debate was one that was brewing for a long time, as was whether or not we should be able to sell wine and beer in grocery stores. That was an initiative that was led by mostly the grocery stores in the state of Minnesota back in the 90s. That was unsuccessful, and I think that's when everyone decided to work towards this Sunday sales. Since the Sunday sales passed, what we've seen is it's highlighted sort of the silliness of this law that we have that allows us to sell 3.2% alcohol beer in convenience stores. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of people would just as soon drive to Wisconsin than drink 3.2 beer and purchase it at their local convenience store. So right now what we found is a law that we've got beer that's being sold in a convenience store that nobody's purchasing because we now have Sunday sales. So I think the grocery and the convenience stores are put together a coalition to try to either expand the law to allow stronger beers to be sold in the convenience stores. Or I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't pass, if we just get rid of the sales of 3.2 beer because it takes up a lot of expensive space on the shelves in the Targets and the Quick Trips and speedways in the state of Minnesota. So I think one of the things that's interesting in the state of Minnesota is we have so much craft beer development, and we also have a very strong and growing craft spirit market here. And I think those groups really they're not really aligned on what they would like to sell in convenience stores. But I think if you ask the Speedways of the world, they would start with maybe a beer up to like a 4.0 beer and see if they could just get by with selling the Coors Lights and the Buds and all the regular low alcohol beers, but certainly ones that are stronger than 3.2.
So you have this weird dichotomy between convenient beer and inconvenient beer, or convenient in Minnesota and then the stuff you drive to Wisconsin for. Fascinating.
Well, I think Utah might be the only other state that even sells 3.2 beer. I'm actually surprised anyone's still making it.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and thank you so much for characterizing this as a brewing debate.
We have a whole list of those.
Yeah. So how you said expected bill would allow such sales? Can you give any kind of a prediction on the likelihood of first of all, a bill being put together, and then second, that something would pass?
Yeah, I can take that one on. There's a coalition of vendors, retailers, I should say, that are sorting through what they would like this bill to look like. And I think, as I mentioned, last year there was a bill that was put together very hastily, in my mind, at the very end of session, that allowed the sale of craft beer as well as low alcohol beer and spirits that were distilled in Minnesota. That was what the bill said. And it wasn't very well thought out. It wasn't well drafted, and it was introduced late in session, so there were a few cursory hearings on it, but it didn't really go anywhere. So I think I can't tell you exactly what the bill is going to say. I don't think it's going to be very well received by the Senate chair of the Commerce Committee, who is sort of the Dr. No as it comes to new alcohol provisions in Minnesota. But that doesn't mean that the bill won't get developed and introduced. I don't think I have any insights as to the new chair of the Commerce Committee, Representative Halverson, where she would come down on hearing the bill and where she is personally with it. But I do expect a bill to be developed and introduced before the deadline.
Terrific. So moving from weak beer to strong beer and on, of course, to the leafy green, as it were. Being in the state of Washington and on the West Coast, as we can see, it's fully green over here. So Cam, you wanted to talk about cannabis. What's the state of affairs in Minnesota currently?
So as folks can see on the map there, the darker green represents a state where there is medical marijuana and only medical marijuana that is legal. And then that other green is recreational and medical is permitted. So Minnesota, as you can see, is just medical marijuana. Adjacent North Dakota has just medical. Across Lake Superior, though, in Michigan, take note that recreational marijuana has just been legalized there as of back in November. And, of course, there's Canada that has now legalized it all across the country. So around Minnesota, there are jurisdictions that are legalizing for recreational use. And so it's a very active debate here in Minnesota policy circles. Folks may know that now the four major parties in Minnesota, I kid you not, are the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the Republican Party, and then two different marijuana legalization parties that established that status through their performance in the 2018 elections. I don't know the tale of why there are not just one but two marijuana legalization parties. You think they'd want to merge, but maybe we need the great-great-grandson of Hubert Humphrey to come in and architect that one to merge those parties. But anyway.
Well, they're probably trying to figure out, whether they should support Doritos or Cheetos.
Cheetos.
So.
That's right. The party platform.
Joking, of course. It's interesting. Obviously on the West Coast, that's been legal for a while. The percentage of the adult population that lives in a state where marijuana is legal in some way or another is a shockingly high percentage of the U.S. population. And interestingly, when I have kind of quiet, private conversations with growers of various other products, soybean, wheat, et cetera, they all kind of whisper, well, we grow things to certain quality standards and harvest them for production and sales. So this is something, and that could be grown, harvested for production and sold. So it's fascinating just to see the shift in dynamic here, and really kind of a comparatively short time frame from my perspective.
Absolutely. The debate has cropped up on recreational marijuana, cropped up very fast here in Minnesota. And if we look at the next slide, I borrowed here a formulation that the new Speaker of the House, Democrat Melissa Hortman, put forward. And she talked about the continuum between, on the one end, expanding medical marijuana, and then in the middle, decriminalizing possession or use of marijuana, and then at the far other end, legalization. And so that's the frame that she's put on the discussion. And what's struck me as I've heard both Republican leaders and Democratic leaders talking about this topic is they're all pointing out the same points. They're not falling into camps that are just throwing talking points back and forth at each other. Both sides in this discussion are thinking through the pros and the cons of legalization. From a strictly government budgeting standpoint, a pro could be tax revenue. Colorado and Minnesota have roughly the same population, and Colorado is now bringing in $250 million each year in tax revenue from sale of marijuana. Cons, of course, include impaired driving, impact on developmental functions in adolescence. Folks know the tale. So those are the points that both Republicans and Democrats are working through. I definitely do not expect legalization in Minnesota this year, but I do expect the discussion to continue at a high volume.
It's interesting when we in Washington State had the statutes and the like, or actually it was an initiative here to legalize marijuana. That happened in the context of Colorado, and recognizing both the things that were working and not working about their regulatory scheme. And so now with multiple other jurisdictions having it legalized for all purposes, it's both helpful, I would suspect, but also challenging because what's not working, you want to fix it, but you now know what the issues are.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And given that it's already legal from a medical perspective, here in Washington, we had that same step. So there was a legalization from a medical perspective first, and then recreational. But what happened was that the recreational was actually less regulated than medical, and so very quickly anyone who was selling medical stopped because they were hampered by all these regulations. So, so do you anticipate that kind of evolution, or do you or no change? What are you guessing will happen here?
My educated guess is that in 2019 there will be no change, but that by say 2021, if there were legalized marijuana, I could believe that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but when you look at the poll numbers, who controls which offices, and the trend, that's a realistic outcome.
Molly, what would your prediction be?
Well, I think what's interesting is the two things. One is, and I'm going to pick on Colorado because that's where I have 26 relatives and a daughter that just graduated from college. But
congratulations.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I've heard routinely is this is a similar parallel to the sports betting debate that we're going to probably have in Minnesota is, if your goal is, if you want to do this because of the revenue, I think there are a lot of people saying, you know, that's a really bad reason to legalize marijuana in Minnesota. However, one of the things we see, this $250 million annually in revenue in Colorado, I think they're really trying to drill down on whether or not, what the cost to the state of Colorado is to actually bring in that $250 million and to really quantify, honestly, the pros and cons to society, to youth, to the homeless issue, et cetera, et cetera. And I think our state, what I hear is them wanting to, now that we're not going to be the first ones in, let's make sure we're the most educated state that gets into this. And then the other comment that I've heard from a fair number, mostly Republicans, I would say, is as more and more states decide to legalize this, why don't we federalize it? Wouldn't that make more sense? And have everything be regulations, and then looking at this finance piece of it, have that all be similar. So those are my two observations. I see a lot of smart people thinking smartly about how we want to do this in Minnesota.
Fascinating. It'll be fun and interesting to watch that debate evolve. So the seventh topic, second to last here, is employment law proposals, and you know, many of these are quite familiar from anybody following the national debate or other jurisdictions. So, Molly, can you describe kind of who's behind the proposals and the likelihood of them moving forward?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. I would say that I'm kind of knee-deep in this whole topic. I feel like I'm drinking water out of a fire hose on these employment law issues for this session. And I know we have another slide talking about regulatory issues, which is important, so I'll go through this stuff pretty quickly because it's not directly on point. But if I was to say collectively, these items were to pass as they are currently introduced, this would have more financial impact on most companies on this call than any tax increase would possibly have. Right now in Minnesota, we have a bill, of the top 10 bills introduced by the House Democrats, we have a wage theft prevention bill. We have a paid family leave bill that would create an entirely new system that would overlay the employer-based system that we currently have in Minnesota. We have a proposal to eliminate the use or prohibit the use of the severe or pervasive standard for sexual harassment claims in Minnesota. And then not on the slide is we also have a bill mandating, oh no, it's on there, sick time mandate, and I think there might be one other one. So again, a tax credit for employers, which is introduced by the Republicans in the Senate. So I think what we're seeing right now is an opportunity, a potential opportunity on the part of advocates for a state-run paid family leave system. That the way this bill is drafted, it's a employer-employee contribution that the dollar amount is not defined yet in the statute, which is kind of convenient because they're probably trying to figure out how they can put a fiscal note on a system and putting together a system like this in the state. So, so we've got the Walz administration and the Democrats on one side, and they are moving fast on this. It's very popular. I think it's popular with the advocacy groups in the state. And unfortunately, the bill as introduced is just horrible. It's duplicative of what we are currently doing in the private sector, and it's going to cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars to implement a system that we currently don't have. And Mike, you're from Washington. I know that Washington and Massachusetts are the two states that are developing a paid family leave system from ground up. The other states that currently offer this are built off of their disability insurance proposal that the state already operates, and it's become less of an employer mandate, but the employer involvement is simply to collect the money through payroll and then get that to the state, and then the state actually is in the business of providing the payout to the individual. So
that would be California as an example.
Yep, that's the California model.
Here in Washington, we've had a statute which is now just being implemented. They started the taxing program in January, and then the leave program will happen in January of next year. There is a opportunity for opt-out, but working with companies, very few have decided to opt out because it's so expensive to administer, and it really makes somebody being sick for a week incredibly complicated to administer and figure out. Okay, so do you get PTO for that? Do you get paid family leave for that? How many times do you go to the doctor that week? Is it FMLA? Is it state FMLA? It creates a lot of work for lawyers, which for Dorsey and Whitney is great, but lots of complication for our customers. The other one I would just highlight there is predictive scheduling, because some jurisdictions, there have been movements towards that in New York, and then in the city of Seattle, we do have predictive scheduling for certain industries, and that is very difficult because what it means is that if you're in a production environment, you need to tell people you're going to start at this time and you'll end at that time, and you can't move that schedule without paying an extraordinary penalty. So it sounds straightforward, but in practicality is very, very difficult. So that would be one to watch for sure. So for any employer who's on the, obviously, I would imagine virtually everybody who's calling into this program works for a company that's got employees. How could they kind of work with you, Molly, to understand what the proposals are and the ways that they could help influence those proposals one direction or another?
Well, that's a great question, and right now, Dorsey and Whitney, I work with the head of our employment group in the Minneapolis office, Ryan Mick. We have an organization that's been in place for, I'm going to say, at least 20 years, I think it was developed by Rob Reinhardt and Melissa Raffan, and that's the Minnesota Employment Law Council, which was originally developed to allow human resource lawyers for the large Minnesota companies to sort of brainstorm and do some benchmarking on things such as paid time off and other things that are common sort of administrative similarities that all the companies have together. One of the offshoots of that is the necessity to do some state lobbying work, as well as some municipal lobbying. I think you mentioned the predictive scheduling. I would say Cam's work at the Minnesota Chamber, combined with our good friends at Graco, as well as Ryan Mick from MELC, were pretty instrumental in making sure that predictive scheduling was not included in the sick time mandate that went into effect, I think, I'm going to say January 1st of this year. So I think we'd be happy to broaden our coalition, and I'm certainly happy to consult with anybody that would like additional information about any of these bills. These are not going away. And I think as we see our state, our legislature being made up more of urban and suburban Democrats, these issues are only going to become more front and center. And I think it's really important for employers to make sure these laws work for all of us, and that they're developed and they're drafted in a way where we don't have a lot of unforeseen consequences.
So leading to the idea of unforeseen consequences, and in the last 2 minutes here, I love this idea, the governor of regulatory humility. What's happening in this policy area?
So yeah, in our closing minute here, and my thanks to everybody for participating today. Brand new Governor Tim Walz, Democrat. He's been in office a week. And his explicit message to his regulatory agencies and all of his department heads is to demonstrate, quote unquote, regulatory humility. And I'll tell you, boy, that sounds really good. I mean that, seriously, that sounds really good after 8 years of a lack of regulatory humility that has tripped up many folks on this call and your companies. So we're still in a honeymoon phase with Governor Walz, and the tension between executive branch folks who want to require companies to do things versus employers and actors in the private sector who are trying to run their businesses, that tension is real. It will always be there. It's manifested itself in some things like some legislative action to prohibit the State Department of Agriculture from moving ahead with a groundwater rule that would have impacted fertilizer. That rule still exists, but the implementation's delayed. And we don't have a lot of time to get into details there, but my closing point is this. It is great to hear Governor Walz say that he wants folks to act with regulatory humility, but everybody on this call knows that we have to make sure that they do. And so Dorsey and Whitney is ready to help you all make your cases and make sure that regulators act with that humility so that you all can keep running the great businesses that you run.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for a really interesting set of issues and overview of what's happening in Minnesota. For those who would like to get continuing education credit, you'll be receiving a sign-in sheet, and then you've already received the reminder email. If you return that survey to Michelle Hubble, who's identified also in the survey itself, then she's the manager of our CLE programs and will return a certificate for you. We also appreciate both your feedback on today's presentation and also any ideas you have on future programs that you'd like to hear about. So with that, if you have any questions, please contact Molly or Cam on these or other regulatory issues that are facing your companies. And with that, both to Molly and Cam, thank you a lot for this presentation.
Our pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.